April Jones was born on April 4, 2007, in a small British town called Mackinac. It was a quiet, peaceful place with a population of just over 2,000 people, located far from any big cities. April was the youngest in her family, with an older brother and sister. She loved spending time with friends, riding her favorite pink bike through the streets of her town, and swimming. In 2012, when she turned 5, April started primary school. She quickly stood out as a bright and determined student, and the teachers adored her. She was also a social butterfly, making friends with other kids almost instantly. On October 1, 2012, April went to her swimming lesson at a local sports center while her parents attended a school meeting. After that, she invited her friend over, and her parents drove them home. The girls watched cartoons together, and around 7 p.m., April wanted to go outside for a walk. At first, her mom was hesitant because it was already getting dark, but April still found a way to convince her. She had done well in school the day before, so as a reward, her mom eventually decided to let her go. She just reminded the girls not to wander too far from home. And with that, April grabbed her bike and took off. About 20 minutes later, April's mom stepped outside to call her home, but she was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in immediately. She started searching the nearby streets, hoping to spot her daughter. The neighborhood was on the outskirts of town, a small residential area with several apartment buildings. She walked around, checking behind the buildings, but there was no sign of April. Finally, she spotted April's friend and rushed over to ask if she'd seen her. And the friend's answer sent chills down her spine. The girl told her that a car had pulled up next to them. April talked to the driver, got inside, and they just drove away. Hearing this, April's mom went into full panic mode and immediately called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived at their home and spoke with April's friend first. She described the vehicle as a gray van and said the driver was a man with dark hair and a beard, wearing a green jacket and sweatpants. She had gotten a good look at him because he actually stepped out of the van and helped April climb inside. Her mother later explained that April had cerebral palsy, which made it difficult for her to get into a vehicle on her own. April's friend also mentioned something that seemed a little off. She said April got into the van on the driver's side. Right away, police realized this likely meant the vehicle had a left-hand drive. That stood out because, in the UK, most cars have the steering wheel on the right side. April's friend had simply assumed she was getting into the driver's seat, but in reality, she was probably entering the van from the passenger side. Realizing that April had most likely been abducted, police immediately called for backup and declared it a critical incident. A massive search operation kicked off, and investigators sent out an alert with details on the suspect and his van. Word of April's disappearance spread like wildfire, first through the neighborhood and then beyond. Dozens of people gathered outside her home, eager to help with the search. But at that stage, the crowd actually made things more difficult for police, who needed to go door to door, questioning every resident. Meanwhile, people started sharing the news online, drawing even more volunteers to the area. As the night went on, hundreds of people joined the search, combing the streets alongside law enforcement. The situation was so urgent that even the local waste collection service stopped working because every single worker left their job to help look for April. Before long, the case made national headlines. News outlets picked up the story, and the police issued a public appeal asking anyone with information to come forward. They released April's photo and a description of the suspect, and soon, tips started flooding in. Unfortunately, despite the massive effort, the search turned up nothing. Within the first few hours, they had combed through the entire town, but there was no sign of April. The next step was to search the surrounding forests and fields, but that was easier said than done. By then, it was pitch black outside, and rain had started to fall. The terrain around the town was rough and hard to navigate, and officers knew they wouldn't be able to cover much ground overnight. Still, they refused to stop. The search continued until morning, and as the sun came up, even more volunteers joined in. Some had even traveled from other towns to help. Meanwhile, police expanded their efforts, putting up missing persons alerts on billboards outside the city, hoping for any kind of lead. With the news of the case spreading across the country, police were flooded with calls, but most of the tips didn't lead anywhere. Still, that morning, one name kept coming up, a name mentioned by multiple callers. It was a local resident, 46-year-old Mark Bridger. He quickly became a person of interest for several reasons. First, He matched the suspect's description. Second, he was one of the few people in town who drove a left-hand drive vehicle. But the biggest red flag was that someone had spotted Bridger's car near April's neighborhood right around the time she vanished. When police started digging into Mark Bridger's background, they discovered a long rap sheet. Though his crimes were mostly minor to moderate, he had been arrested multiple times for assaults, thefts, and various offenses like driving without a license. Detectives started tracking him down and found a few addresses where he could be staying. They sent officers to all of them at once, but Bridger and his car were nowhere to be found. Then, just minutes later, detectives caught a break. A police helicopter spotted him walking his dog not far from home. But what really stood out was his behavior. The helicopter had been circling for nearly half an hour, and he never looked up, not even once. A short while later, a police officer approached Bridger and asked him to identify himself. He gave his name and immediately added, "I know what this is about." The officer then asked the question everyone wanted an answer to, "Where is April?" Bridger responded, "It was an accident. I hit her with my car." Right after that, he was placed under arrest and taken to the station. During the drive, he kept talking, despite the fact that the officer didn't ask any additional questions. He claimed he had no idea where April was because he had blacked out. According to him, after accidentally hitting her with his car, she was unresponsive. He panicked, put her in his vehicle, and tried to give her first aid, but nothing worked. Then, he said, everything just went blank for hours, and by the time he came to, April's body was gone. Bridger insisted that after realizing what had happened, he spent the entire night searching for her, wandering through the forests and fields. He also claimed that he only found out who April was that morning when he saw news reports about her disappearance on TV. Naturally, detectives weren't buying Bridger's story because there were too many inconsistencies. First, there was April's friend, who had seen everything. She clearly remembered April talking to the driver and getting into the van with his help, fully conscious. But Bridger insisted he had hit her with his car and placed her inside while she was unconscious. So his version just didn't match the eyewitness account. Then, there was the whole memory blackout claim. It sounded far-fetched on its own, but what made it even more suspicious was what police discovered next. Shortly after April disappeared, Bridger had shaved off his hair and beard. It looked like a clear attempt to alter his appearance and avoid being caught. Still, Bridger stuck to his story. When detectives pointed out the inconsistencies, he changed his tune slightly, now claiming he had been heavily drunk that day, which, in theory, could explain his supposed memory blackout. He also insisted that while he couldn't remember where he had put April's body, he was sure she was dead and in a safe place. No matter how hard investigators pressed him, they couldn't get the truth out of him, so they shifted their focus to his house. The moment they stepped inside, they were hit with a strong smell of cleaning products. The house was also uncomfortably hot. That's when they noticed the wood-burning stove in the living room. It had clearly been running for hours. Forensic teams collected the ashes and sent them for testing. But aside from that, there were no obvious clues, no sign of April, no belongings, nothing. However, when forensics took a closer look, they found traces of blood, and the lab results later confirmed it was April's. Next, investigators turned their attention to Bridger's car. If his story was true, that he had accidentally hit April with his vehicle, there should have been some evidence to back it up. But there wasn't. There was no blood inside the car, no damage to the exterior, nothing that suggested an accident had even happened. Once again, his version of events didn't add up. Then came the results from the ashes in his fireplace. Forensic experts found 17 fragments of human bone, all belonging to April. Another bone fragment was also discovered in the bathroom drain. This confirmed the heartbreaking reality: April was no longer alive. But detectives didn't believe Bridger had managed to completely destroy her remains. It was far more likely that he had taken what was left and hidden it somewhere. So despite the grim discovery, police pushed forward with their search, determined to find whatever was left. The news that April was most likely dead sent shockwaves through the community. Until that moment, people had held on to hope that she would be found alive. Now, the focus of the search had shifted. Hundreds of volunteers and police officers were no longer looking for a missing girl but for her remains, so her family could lay her to rest. By then, the search operation had grown into something massive. In fact, it would go down as the largest in the country's modern history. Alongside local volunteers, hundreds of professionals from various emergency services joined in. They searched through the most difficult terrains, rivers, forests, lakes, determined to find any trace of April. Meanwhile, detectives kept digging for evidence linking Bridger to the crime. When they examined his computer, they found something really disturbing. It was filled with illegal content involving minors. Even more sickening, he had saved photos of victims from other high-profile cases. On top of that, they found dozens of images of local children from their own town, including April and her older sister. It seemed like he had been downloading their pictures from social media. Then investigators uncovered something even more unsettling. April's older sister revealed that just a few months before the abduction, Bridger had sent her a friend request on social media. She had mentioned it to their father, who immediately recognized the name. He had known Bridger back in the early 90s but had lost touch with him over the years. The request struck him as odd. Why would Bridger, a grown man, want to connect with his teenage daughter? Trusting his instincts, he told her not to accept it. It's also worth mentioning that Bridger was a father himself. He had 6 children from 4 different women, yet at the time of April's disappearance, he lived alone. Police discovered a troubling pattern. Bridger frequently pursued relationships with women who had young children. Given the horrific evidence found on his computer, this detail took on a whole new level of significance and only made detectives more convinced they were dealing with a predator. As police dug deeper into Bridger's background, they discovered that he never stuck to one job for long, constantly jumping between different fields of work. He also had a habit of making up stories about himself. To some people, he claimed he had served in the military and even had to change his identity for security reasons, but that was a complete lie. What made it even stranger was that he repeated this claim during police interrogations. He insisted that he had served his country, that he was a good person, and that he would never have done something like this on purpose. Between that and his strange claims about April's death, detectives started to realize they were probably dealing with a pathological liar. It didn't matter how many times his stories were proven false. He just kept sticking to them. They also learned something else supporting this theory. Bridger had told everyone he knew that his parents were dead, but in reality, they were very much alive. Another interesting detail was that Bridger had broken up with his girlfriend just days before April's abduction. People who knew him said he didn't take it well at all. He started drinking heavily, and it only sent him further downhill. As police continued combing through his computer, they found something even more disturbing. Just hours before April disappeared, Bridger had messaged 3 different women asking to meet up, but all of them turned him down. After that, he opened and watched some illegal content from his sickening collection. At this point, his guilt seemed undeniable, but there was still one major problem. April's remains were nowhere to be found. Desperate for answers, detectives repeatedly turned to the public, hoping that someone had seen him or his vehicle that night. Any small lead could help them retrace his steps and finally figure out what he had done with April's body. At some point, a witness came forward with an interesting lead. He reported seeing Bridger the morning after April's abduction, around 9 a.m. The man was walking along the riverbank carrying a black bag. Investigators also discovered that shortly after that, Bridger had taken his car to a repair shop. The mechanics remembered him well because he had been acting strangely. By that time, everyone in town knew about April's disappearance, and emotions were running high. But Bridger talked about the case as if he were a grieving parent. He was on the verge of tears, speaking as though the missing child was his own. His reaction stood out to the workers. It was overly emotional, almost theatrical, and something about it just didn't sit right. Following this new lead, search teams focused their efforts along the river, hoping to find any trace of April. But no matter how thoroughly they combed the area, they still found nothing. Realizing that April's body might never be recovered, detectives made a difficult decision. They charged Bridger with murder, relying on the overwhelming evidence they already had. With April's blood found inside Bridger's home, police pieced together what they believed had happened. Their theory was that Bridger lured April into his car under some pretense, then took her back to his house, committed SA, and killed her. After that, he started disposing of her body. Investigators learned that Bridger had previously worked at a slaughterhouse. They suspected he might have used those skills to get rid of the body before burning parts of her remains in his fireplace. But forensic experts agreed there was no way he had gotten rid of everything, which meant some of it had to be hidden somewhere else. With the case moving forward, Bridger was placed in jail to await trial, which was set to begin in a few months. Meanwhile, search teams weren't planning to give up. Even as the weather got worse and new leads dried up, they kept searching, still hoping to find April's remains. The prosecution was confident they could secure a conviction even without a body, but they still refused to give up the search. In total, search teams scoured 60 square kilometers, or 37 square miles, of land, covering every possible location where April's remains could have been hidden. But they found nothing. In the end, April's parents had no choice but to bury only the small fragments recovered from Bridger's home. To honor her memory, they also placed some of her belongings inside the coffin. Hundreds of people attended her funeral, many traveling from other towns just to say goodbye. Over the course of the search, April had become like family to an entire community, and now they had to let her go. In January 2013, 3 months after April's murder, Bridger stood before the judge and pleaded not guilty to murder. But at the same time, he admitted that he was likely responsible for her death. During the trial, he stuck to his story, claiming that he had accidentally run over April with his car, despite overwhelming evidence proving otherwise. He also insisted that he still couldn't remember where he had hidden her remains. And yet, Bridger continued to paint himself as the good guy, saying he had only wanted to help April after the so-called accident. The trial lasted until late May, and in the end, the jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, which is a pretty rare sentence in the UK. After the trial, Bridger was transferred to a new prison, where he was attacked by another inmate. He stabbed him several times with a shank, but the injuries weren't fatal. 4 years after his conviction, detectives kept reaching out to Bridger, hoping he'd finally tell them where April's remains were. But he never wavered, he just kept insisting he remembered nothing. Then, out of nowhere, police got a tip from another inmate. According to him, Bridger had confessed, saying he had dumped April's remains in the river near his home. But investigators weren't convinced. If a bag containing human remains had been thrown into the water, it likely would have surfaced. And given that search teams had thoroughly scanned the river for miles, it seemed highly unlikely that Bridger was telling the truth. A year after his sentencing, the local government bought Bridger's house, and in November 2014, they decided to demolish it. Hundreds of locals, including April's parents, gathered to watch as the house was torn down, the very place where she had been taken from them. In 2018, April's family faced yet another heartbreaking ordeal. Her father fell seriously ill and suffered partial memory loss. When he regained consciousness, he started asking his wife why April hadn't come to visit him in the hospital. And so, she had to break the news to him all over again, telling him that their daughter was gone. In a cruel twist of fate, he was forced to relive the pain of losing April a second time. As for the search for her remains, it hasn't resumed since 2013. Police have stated that they are willing to restart the search if new information comes in, but so far, there has been no progress. It has now been over 12 years since April was taken, and detectives admit that the chances of ever finding her are slim to none. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.